Hello again, and welcome to weeks 8 and 9. This lecture is going to look at different methods, different approaches, different best practices for embedding library instruction, library resources, librarians, etc. in online classes. Um, as I'm sure you know, and being in an online program, you know it quite well, online learning is growing extremely rapidly, and some schools, even half of their population are doing their entire program online. We have entire online programs, as you are very familiar with. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about online learners, and then get into the different approaches for embedding the library online. So, who are online learners in higher education? Obviously, you are online learners in higher education. I got my library degree online, so I was an online learner in higher education. So these are just statistics that are very general. By and large, online learners tend to be older. They tend to be above the age of 25. More than half are above the age of 35. So a lot of times these are people who don't go into college straight from high school, and they appreciate the convenience of online learning. They have often a lot of competing priorities. They're usually employed. Many also have families and a lot of other things that are competing for their attention. So, convenience and flexible pacing and their working with their work schedule are top factors in determining their enrollment. Many see education as a means to an end. I think often with college students who go into college right from high school, um, they often don't, many of them don't see like a clear path to a very specific career. But the people going into online learning often see education as, well, I'm doing this so that I can move up in my job, or I'm doing this so I can become a social worker or a librarian or whatever. It's very focused, and that's a very different population than a population who, you know, is going to college because they think they should go to college because that's what smart, motivated people do. They tend to have much higher expectations for their learning experiences than students in on-campus programs. And this is shown in the literature, but I've also seen it anecdotally at Norwich. We did the LibQual study, which is basically a satisfaction survey that was created by the Association of Research Libraries, and it's great because you can do benchmarking against other institutions. It's valid and reliable and all that good stuff. But we found that our graduate students, who were all online, had much higher expectations in just about every level than did most graduate students we saw at other institutions. Fortunately, we also found that their satisfaction with our services was higher, because in this survey they have to say what their minimum desired level of service is, what their ideal desired level of service is, and where the library falls. And we found that their expectations were always higher, but also their satisfaction was higher, which made us obviously very, very happy. And obviously, online learning is becoming the new normal. Whether people are doing programs entirely online, or if they're if they're just taking a few classes online because it's really convenient, almost a third of all students are taking at least one online course in 2010, and that's certainly grown in the past few years. So it's really, you know, going into academic librarianship, online learning is something you're going to be thinking a lot about. We certainly are at Portland State, even though online learning only makes up 10% of the classes that we teach. So libraries are creating lots of content for online learners. They're creating LibGuides, they're creating web pages, they're creating fabulous tutorials, and we're offering lots of support. We're offering, 24/7 chat reference with a human being where you can get somebody all the time. Um, but just because you build this stuff doesn't mean students are going to discover it. And I've seen so many distance learning presentations at conferences that say like, if you build it, will they come? So here's my version of that. Because just because you have this stuff available, if it's not at the student's point of need, they're not going to necessarily find it. So when you think about it, the learning management system is essentially their campus when for an online student. That's their campus, and everything should be accessible from that. So the library should absolutely have some sort of presence in the learning management system. And libraries have taken many very different approaches to this, some good, some not so good, and we're going to look at some of those different approaches. So there are lots of different levels of embedding, and you read the Schenk and DeWald article where they define the macro level and the micro level. You read another article that looked at the nano level. I'm going to talk about what I call the molecular level of library involvement, and that's sort of what I see as being the ideal. But your mileage may vary, and obviously molecular level involvement is much more time consuming to create than macro level involvement. So let's look at the different levels. Macro level library involvement is basically creating a single library presence for distance learners in the learning management system. And you don't even necessarily have to create a presence in the learning management system. You could simply have a link in the learning management system for the library that takes them out to an external page. So it doesn't necessarily have to be built into the learning management system. But you could conceivably have a specific presence in the LMS. You could have a course shell in the learning management system in which every student is enrolled. I think this is a tremendously bad idea. I've seen libraries do it. I think it's a terrible idea because you're asking students to leave their course and go to something specifically for the library, which just doesn't seem like the best way to make yourself accessible to students. It could be in every course, or it could be on the LMS homepage. I think the ideal is to have a link to the library in every single course because they're more likely to find it then. I know our learning management system administrator people post news on the front page of D2L, and faculty and students just never see this because they go straight to their course. So having something that's not specifically in the course just doesn't make a great deal of sense. But of course, there's political issues, and you really have to work closely with whoever the team is that creates content for the learning management system, who administers it, because they're the ones who are going to be able to give you the ability to do different things in the LMS. So here's some different options at this university. You'll see they have, and I know it's really tiny, they have a little library tab up there that students can click on to get to a generic library portal with useful subject links, with their chat widget, all that good stuff. Here's another one with a library tab where, this isn't keyed to a specific subject, it just has the very general stuff that students might need. Here's one where the library is actually not just a tab, but is a little widget on the front page of the course web page, which can be really helpful. But I mean, it's very little content there. It's not ideal, but it's not terrible. And this is one where the library is actually a separate course, which, as I said, I think is a tremendously bad idea. And my God, looking at how wordy this is, I can't even imagine that students would bother to go through it. So macro level library involvement, the biggest pro to doing this is that it's dead simple. I mean, you're creating one page or one presence or whatever, or even one little widget. So it's very easy to create, it's easy to maintain. You don't have to work with faculty in specific classes because you're just creating one generic tool. That's great. The cons are, yeah, it's generic. It might not meet the specific needs of all courses and programs. So I don't see it as really being ideal. There's sort of an intermediate level between macro and micro. This is a term that I coined as well, so you're not probably going to see it in the literature, but it's called meso-level library involvement. It's where you create a single library presence, just like you do with macro level, but you're providing resources tailored to specific programs or courses. And this is the approach that we took at Norwich, where we have a single library presence, whoops, there we go, that students can get to by clicking on the library tab here, and it then takes them to this front page where they can then click on their program. So let's say they click on diplomacy. They'll then see content that is specifically tailored to their program. So we don't have to worry about, having different links in different classes to different guides or whatever. It's all one link, but the content is tailored once they click on the link for their program. So it's one extra click for students to get to their information, but at least it is tailored and targeted. So micro-level library involvement is library presence that's targeted to specific courses, and I'd say also or specific programs and subject areas, because this could be creating like a LibGuide for a specific class or a specific subject area. This could be a course-specific presence that you create, or it could even be learning objects that you've developed to support specific programs. So the biggest thing to think about with micro-level library involvement when you are tailoring it to the specific program or class is how the content actually gets into the classroom, because then you're not just having a single link that takes them to a generic library presence. You have to actually get it into each individual classroom. So you could have a single library presence in every classroom that dynamically gets them to subject-specific content that's embedded automatically into each classroom. And that's the approach we've taken at Portland State, which I'll show you in a second. You could manually embed content in the course where the librarian's actually doing it or the faculty members doing it. That takes a lot more effort because you're doing it for each course. You could have content embedded automatically into each classroom, which is another approach you could take. I think the less that faculty have to do and the less that you have to do manually, the better. So here you'll see this is a course page where on the right-hand side they have a little library widget where they link to specific databases, and that's not a generic presence. They have a system where you put in the course ID information, the course name, all of that good stuff, and then you define the resources that show up in that classroom. That's really time consuming because you have to define that for every individual class, which seems to me a tremendous burden if you're doing this for hundreds and hundreds of classes. Maybe if you do it at the subject level, that would be a manageable thing to do, but if you're doing it at the course level, it's really complex. So at Portland State, we have a similar little library widget here, and you see that there's a link to a research guide. They can get to our reference help stuff. They can search the catalog, all that good stuff. We actually just launched a new version, which I don't have a screenshot of, but we launched a new version that also dynamically links to course reserves for that class, so that's been hugely helpful, and faculty have been over the moon about that. But the way we link to course guides and subject guides and all that good stuff is dynamically. So if there is a course guide available for a specific course, they'll see this. They'll see a link that takes them to the research guide for that specific course. So it would say, research guide for BA 101 or History 102, whatever. If there's a guide available in their subject, they'll see a link to research guide for anthropology, research guide for business. We can also have multiple research guides show up there. Like for anthropology, I have 3 separate guides. So when they press a little plus button, and then it shows the 3 different guides, so they can get to the content that is most relevant to them. If there's nothing, it takes them to the front page of our LibGuide system so that they can find the content that they need. I don't think there are any cases where we don't have a subject guide tailored to an area in which courses are taught, but it might be possible that that's the case. So you'll see here the way that the content dynamically goes into the widget is through tagging LibGuides. So this is a LibGuide for Peoples and Cultures of Latin America, ANTH 311. So you'll see here that I tagged it with the course number, and that, because with those tags, that will dynamically make that be a link, that LibGuide be a link in their classroom. And the same goes for research guides. I can tag subject guides with ANTH, and then any anthropology class that doesn't have a specific course guide will have a link to the subject guides that I tagged with ANTH. So there are other approaches. You'll see at Humboldt State and also at Cal State Chico, what they do is they give faculty instruction on how to embed research guides in their classrooms. So they're asking the faculty to actually do the work, which I think is extremely problematic because faculty probably aren't going to do it because they're really busy and they're not looking at library documentation, unfortunately. This approach also relies on faculty to do the work, but it's a much more elegant solution. So see, they can actually tailor their widget to exactly what they want. So they can have a search box or no search box. They can link to a library course page that already exists. They can link to course reserves or not link to them, and then it just gives them embed code that they put into Moodle. So that's a really elegant way, but still it's relying on the faculty to actually do the work. And in this case, this librarian, Travis, is suggesting that faculty add him as a course designer to the class so that he can put in library content manually. And as we said, putting in content manually is really time consuming. But on top of that, he can't put any content in unless the faculty member adds him. So you're both depending here on the faculty member's initiative and the librarian's time. So very problematic approach in my opinion. So lots of pros to micro-level library involvement. You can obviously tailor your content to the specific needs of an individual class or an individual program. You can connect much more with students in your area. If you're the subject librarian for anthropology, as I am, you can really help put a human face on the library by having really tailored content that also shows who you are. The negatives, in many cases, it requires a lot more effort to build and maintain. In pretty much every case, even with the Portland State widget, while it doesn't take much time now for us to do these things, though we still have to build course guides and subject guides, the work of creating the widget itself and the functionality did take some time on the front end. And to do an approach like that, it's not something that I personally would be capable of doing, or most librarians. We had a web programmer who was able to create that functionality. Had we not had that, we would have had to take a very different approach. In some cases, this requires a lot more collaboration with faculty, not just to create the tailored content, because obviously you have to know what the course is about, what their assignments are, etc., to create a good course guide, but also if you need the faculty's support to even get the content into the classroom, that requires a lot of marketing and relationship building. So you read an article today on nano level library involvement, which kind of takes it to another level where you're actually you actually have the rights of a course builder as a librarian working within the design of the learning management system to better embed library resources. And obviously this requires the librarian to be involved in building either templates that are used in all classes or that they're involved in designing courses for individual faculty, which, like I said in the micro case, is very, very difficult to achieve and very time consuming to do. So I said that molecular level library involvement was something that I kind of invented. This is sort of a term for really, instead of having a library presence, really weaving library content and instruction, etc., into the design of the course itself. So it's seamless. It doesn't look like it's from the library. It looks like it's part of the course itself. It's not something additional. Sorry, a little congested. So this could mean, as we looked at a few weeks ago, collaborating with faculty on the design of the course or of the research assignments. It could be building learning objects that support specific assignments, or even providing synchronous online instruction, which kind of mirrors what we do in face-to-face classes when we do instruction, or embedding librarians in individual courses, because I think this is at a level that's much deeper than simply having a library presence that students have to click on. It's part of then the course content. So having librarians embedded in a classroom and in class discussions, what that usually looks like is, in most cases, it's librarians having their own discussion board within the class. But you could also have situations where a librarian is involved in the main class discussion board, proactively providing instructional content and help or answering questions. As we talked about last week, super duper time consuming unless you really manage expectations and manage the way that you do this. You could have it just be for like a specific week or a few weeks in the term. In some cases, faculty assign students to ask a librarian for help on their topic or on finding things. Not having that can certainly help with the with decreasing the demand on your time. And also, one thing you'll read this week is the idea of saving questions and answers for later use, because a lot of times, term after term, you're going to get very similar questions. So you could either use that to build an FAQ, or you can save the answers so that when a student asks the question again, you'll have a canned answer that you can just paste in and maybe tailor ever so slightly to their specific question. As I talked about last week, faculty members have to highlight this. If they don't talk about the fact that the librarian's in the classroom here to help, chances are students are not going to stumble upon that and ask questions. And in one of the studies that you're reading this week, even students who didn't actually use discussion boards found it a positive addition to the class. So I find that kind of funny. Like, they just want to know that the librarian's there. Even if they never need it, just knowing the librarian's there is something students really like. And that's kind of problematic because you don't want to be devoting a lot of time to something that doesn't have the return on investment. You could also have the library embedded into course content, like I talked about in the last lecture. Or was it maybe, no, maybe it was a lecture from a few weeks ago. I can't even remember where I talked about it because this stuff all kinds of melds together. The idea that the the idea of actually having the librarian build some of the course content, and embed information literacy in that way, creating lectures or whatever, where it's invisible that it comes from the library, because it doesn't really matter for the student if they're getting library instruction or they're getting instruction from their instructor. When something's really a part of the course curriculum, it's much more likely to be valued by the student. So synchronous online instruction is another option for providing instruction in online courses. And with the growth of web conferencing software, which is now in many cases really mature, and I'm sure you've experienced it here at San Jose State and SLIS, it's really a great possibility for embedding library instruction into classes. You know, the great thing about that, you could provide really tailored instruction using something like Blackboard Collaborate, because you can interact with the students, find out what their needs are, and really focus your instruction on what they need. While I will say that, I think the tendency tends to still be for librarians to prepare canned instruction in web conferencing, just because there's a lot of anxiety about the medium. So that's kind of a shame, because what you'd really ideally want to see is very tailored instruction, because that's the benefit of that over something that's asynchronous. You can create really strong social presence in the classroom by physically being there, which is wonderful. And it really mirrors what we do in face-to-face classes. So you really are providing an equivalent experience. I'll say, on the other hand, the technical barriers to web conferencing can't be underestimated, as well as cognitive load, because the the cognitive load that an instructor experiences when they are both trying to teach and trying to make sure the technology works and keeping an eye on what students are saying is amazingly significant. And I know I've experienced that as well when I've taught, which is why it's really nice when you have somebody else who's sort of focused on the technical part while you're focused on delivering the instruction. You can definitely not cover as much online as you can during a face-to-face session, because you have to do a lot more checking in with students to make sure they're following and they don't have questions and they're okay, because you can't see them. It's really not a good fit for programs that are largely asynchronous. Trying to force students to do something synchronous in a class that's supposed to be asynchronous is just going to mean that most students will not show up. So here's some things to consider when building library presence online. And the simple fact is there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Different institutions, different programs, different classes are going to need different levels of embedding, and you really need to get to understand the program and the classes and the faculty to provide what will best meet their needs, while still not driving yourself completely crazy and overextending yourself and doing something that's not sustainable. Doing assessment in the online medium is so important. We tend to hear from online students who are either very happy or very unhappy with the library, anecdotally through like virtual reference and stuff like that. So you really need to do assessment that's going to get information from more than just the amazingly satisfied and amazingly dissatisfied. Looking at Star Hoffman and Lily Raymond's article, here's some really important best practices. You obviously need administrator buy-in. You need to negotiate the librarian's role, what that's going to look like, what the boundaries are, so that you can do it sustainably. You'll want to get a lot of information about the class ahead of time so that If you are deeply embedded, you can plan for the busy times, and also you can sort of provide proactive information at the point of need. You'll understand the research assignments. You can create LibGuides or whatever other tools that meet the needs of that class. You need to check the courses regularly, which can be really time consuming if there's not some system for alerting you when there is a new post from a student or question from a student. Um, the great thing about being embedded in a class is that you can post information proactively. So when you know something's coming up that students were challenged with in the past, you can address those things so that the next group of students don't have the same problem. Librarians tend to be very wordy, and we tend to have text-heavy content that is really not engaging. The more you can include visuals, infographics, and other things that provide information without too many words, the better. So you're looking at a lot of interesting examples from for this week that sort of illustrate some of these different approaches to embedding library content. I think they're really interesting, and I don't think there is one perfect way. In some institutions, you're limited by your relationships with the people who manage the LMS, or you're limited by technology. There's lots of reasons why you can and can't do certain things. Here are the things that I've learned for what it's worth. I wouldn't do anything that make faculty have to do anything in their classroom. Stuff should just show up automatically, whether that's a link to the library, it's a widget with dynamic content. You just can't expect that most faculty are going to create a library widget and put it in their classroom, or that they're going to give you course design access. You need to make it very obvious where the library is in the classroom. Make it a tab in their course, make it a link on the front page or a widget on the front page. It should be front and center. You really need to build relationships not only with faculty in your departments, but also with the people who run the learning management system and or who support faculty teaching online. Sometimes these are the same people, and sometimes they're two different groups. But the only way you're going to really be able to meaningfully embed the library into the LMS is by getting in good with these people. Depending too much on the LMS can create problems. Like, for example, if you build content specifically within the LMS, or you create, for example, like our dependence on Desire to Learn at my library for that widget that we created. Obviously, if we switch to a new LMS, it's not going to work, and we're going to have to build that customization all over again. Putting a human face on the library is so important. I think for online learners who often feel very socially isolated from their programs, from their universities, it's really important that they see a librarian, that they get to know their librarian in some way, that they see this, having your face, a picture of you there, having information about you, to really put a human face on the library, which will make them feel much more connected to the institution. And obviously, as I said before, we need to understand the cultures of different departments, of our students, of certain classes, of our faculty, etc. I look forward to hearing what your thoughts are on embedding this week, because there's lots of different options, and I'll be curious to see what you guys think are the best approaches.